I saw that. They're not the map you right here. I do that. Sometimes I do the duck. Sell it here. Here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking he's going to sit here, worth it.
Good there?
Yeah, I'm good.
You want water, coffee, man?
Yeah.
Anything?
Coffee would be good. Coffee around. Of course.
Black?
What?
Black?
Yeah, black would be good. also talking about
Vivian Lee died? Where is it? Might say. No, really. Stop it. Fine. Didn't Abe start there? No. She died. Well, she didn't die. Okay, you also fine. Maybe I'm thinking Vivian Lee. Maybe it was Vivian Lee.
Maybe like a quarter. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Can I sit in the tripod?
Well, hopefully the table doesn't bounce.
Yeah, that would be bad. You checked it for security. You got on it.
Yeah, you can try it.
Thank you.
Maybe we need to see the other 50%. Well, there's a group.
I gotta te pego el café.
What?
I'm sorry, I was talking in Spanish.
Listen, I knew it was gonna be the best. I had to.
Hi everyone. Thank you all so much for coming to Mount Jackson this evening. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Just a reminder to silence cell phones before the event begins this evening. It is such an enormous privilege to welcome Amy Goodman, Anthony Arnold, and Viggo Mortensen. For a discussion of the newly reprinted 12th anniversary edition of Twilight Empire: Responses to Occupation, published by Percival Press, an incisive collection of essays from critics and journalists on the American occupation of Iraq. A little about our speakers. Amy Goodman is the host and executive producer of Democracy Now!, which airs on over 1,300 public television and radio stations. The Nyman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard honored Goodman with the 2014 I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence Lifetime Achievement Award. And she is also the first journalist to receive the Right Livelihood Award, which is widely known as the Alternative Nobel Prize. Goodman has co-authored 5 New York Times bestsellers. Her latest two, The Silent Majority and Breaking the Sound Barrier, both written with Dennis Moynihan, give voice to the many ordinary people. Give voice to the many people standing up to corporate and government power. Anthony Arnove, right here. Produced the Academy Award nominated documentary Dirty Wars and wrote, directed and produced The People Speak with Howard Zinn. He is the editor of several books, including Voices of a People's History of the United States, which Arnove co-edited with Zinn, The Essential Chomsky and Iraq Under Siege, and he is the author of The Logic of Withdrawal. He is on the editorial boards of Haymarket Books and the International Socialist Review. Viggo Mortensen, right here, is an artist known for his acting in movies and on stage, but also works as a poet, photographer, and painter. In 2002, he founded Percival Press, an independent publishing house specializing in art, poetry, and critical writing. His mission as editor at Percival is to publish texts, images, and recordings that merit attention but might not otherwise be presented. So we're going to have a conversation between our speakers this evening, after which there will be an opportunity for you all to ask questions that you may have. And we have plenty of copies of the book this evening, which all of our speakers are willing to sign. So do hang around if you want to get a book signed. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you all for coming. I realize that many of you have foregone watching the live broadcast of the Democratic Presidential Forum / debate moderated by Rachel Maddow, and maybe some of you have given up going to see the new James Bond movie yet. But the good news is that both of those things will be shown again and again and again. There'll be other chances, so we appreciate you coming here tonight. You may wonder why we're making such a big deal about a book that was originally published 12 years ago. You may wonder what's Amy Goodman doing here, what's Anthony Arnaud doing here, to present Twilight of Empire Responses to Occupation. If you've looked at the book, you may wonder why Amy and why Anthony and Dennis Kucinich have added new forwards to the originals by Amy and Howard Zinn. And well, the answer for all these things is pretty simple. It's because the essays, underground reports, and poems by Iraqis, North Americans, and others in this book continue to be useful to anyone wishing to understand why the ill-conceived and ill-advised U.S.-led invasion and occupation of Iraq happened, and what have been the consequences, mostly predictable consequences for the Middle East, for West Asia, and the world. I'm going to read, since he's not here, he wanted to be here, but he had to leave today for England. Dennis Kucinich. I'm going to read just a little bit of his intro, and then Amy and Anthony will, I don't know what they're going to do, but they're going to do something. And then as Alice said, we'll get around to...
Remember that song we all practiced?
Yeah.
You'll all join us.
Wait, I think Alice and Nathan here, so.
Okay.
Anyway,
Just to give a flavor, I'll just read the very beginning of Dennis's foreword. Those of us who knew in 2002 that there was no cause to invade Iraq, those who raised their voices for the cause of peace, who gathered together, marched, protested, and lobbied incessantly against the unjustified rush to war, summoned the power of their humanity to demand that America's leaders cease and desist from their ill-considered plan to attack that Western Asian country. With the publication of Twilight of Empire 12 years ago, all who cared enough to challenge the venality and prevarication of the U.S. government could have seen that a benchmark had been established in chronicling the abject corruption of this unprovoked aggression. Unfortunately, the will to war against Iraq was so powerful that it nullified the demands of millions of Americans who openly and vocally insisted Iraq should not be made to pay the price for the terrorist attacks of 9/11, which that country had nothing to do with. The will to war ignored all evidence brought forward in October of 2002 and presented directly by myself to fellow members of Congress, which posited that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, that Iraq had no intention or capability of attacking the U.S., and that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction. An inversion of reality occurred, which claimed absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The media was reduced to being a spear carrier for the government. Over 1 million innocent Iraqis died as a result of the war, mass murder in the cradle of civilization. Hundreds of billions of dollars of damage was wreaked against a sovereign nation whose society was consequently dismembered. Anyway, and it goes on, and it's a really good quote.
Well, this book, Twilight of Empire, is more relevant today, perhaps, than it was 13 years ago. And that is a very sad comment. How is it that 13 years later, we are mired basically in an inferno in the Middle East? We bomb the cradle of civilization back to the cradle. Millions of people are fleeing from their homes in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya. And we talk about whether our leaders talk about whether we should be humanitarian and how many of them we should accept. Sort of compassionate onlookers who just care about human suffering. We are the cause of that suffering. This is what the effects of war look like. This is why we need independent media. to raise these issues. I was just watching a few weeks ago Wolf Blitzer. He was introducing one of the debates. I can't remember if it was a Republican debate or if it was a Democratic debate. And he said, we're going to hear whether we should put boots on the ground. I think this time he was talking about Syria. I don't think it was Iraq. It could have been as relevant or Afghanistan. Whether we're going to put boots on the ground or just bomb from the air. As if that is the spectrum of possibility. Of course, it's much wider than that. That's why we need independent media. We need independent media because it's the oxygen of a democracy. The media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it is wielded as a weapon of war. And it's why we have to take the media back. It should not be a weapon to manufacture consent, as Noam Chomsky says, manufacture consent for war. Let's look at the eve of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Let's go to February 5th, 2003, when, remember, General Colin Powell was the Secretary of State, giving his push for war at the UN. He would later say it was a stain on his career. Lawrence Wilkerson, his chief of staff, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, said, it was the worst moment of his personal and professional life when he made that case for war, saying the evidence is in, there are weapons of mass destruction. It was the nail in the coffin of so many. So, that's what the US government was saying. What was the media saying at the time? The group FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR.org, did a study of the 4 major nightly newscasts in the 2 weeks around Colin Powell giving that push for war at the UN. They looked at the NBC Nightly News, CBS Evening News, ABC World News Tonight, and the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. In that 2-week period, about 6 weeks before the invasion, there were 393 interviews done around war. Now, this is at a time when the American people were divided. About half for the war, half against the war. There were 393 interviews done around war. So how many do you think were with peace leaders, anti-war leaders? 3. 3 of almost 400. That is no longer a mainstream media. That's an extreme media beating the drums for war. And that's why we need a different kind of media, especially in a time of war. My brother David and I wrote a couple of books. One is called The Exception to the Rulers. It's our motto at Democracy Now! And that should be the motto of all the media. That's our role. There's a reason why our profession, journalism, is the only one explicitly protected by the US Constitution, because we're supposed to be the check and balance on power. The second's called static. And the reason we called it that is even in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, all we get is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths, when what we need the media to give us is the dictionary definition of static. Criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. And those movements are there. That is the hope. It's just that they don't quite hit the corporate media radar screen. Think about what happened February 15, 2003. 30 million people rocked the planet for peace. And the effects of that are still felt today. And we need a media that reflects those voices when people can identify with what they are hearing. Not that narrow choice, but what about those in the media asking the question, what if war was not an option? Imagine. Okay, we just take that off the table, so what are we going to do? I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day. War and peace, life and death, and anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country, because they can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us in civilian society to have the discussions that lead to the decisions about whether they live or die, whether they are sent to kill or be killed. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. That's why we need independent presses like Percival Books. This is why we need independent books like Twilight of Empire, Responses to Occupation. We need a media that is not occupied, but is at a forum that is a forum for us all.
So Vigo, this is why I said Amy should go third rather than me.
I don't think it's something to do with
It's alright. It's alright. So first of all, I want to thank Vigo, first of all, for publishing this book 12 years ago, for bringing it back out, for creating Percival Press, for being as outspoken as you've been, and obviously for the privilege of contributing to this new edition. It's a real honor, and
Thank you.
obviously a great honor to, as always, be with Amy and Democracy Now! And it's so important that when you talk about independent media, Amy, you included Percival and independent publishing, because so often when we talk about the independent media landscape, we don't talk about books, we don't talk about bookstores. And so also I want to thank Alice and the whole team at McNally Jackson Books, because this is a vital space. It's interesting that in many cities, bookstores are the last place where you can go. There's not a corporate environment to have the kinds of conversations like this that need to be happening in so many other ways and fora. And so it's vital that bookstores remain, and we support independent bookstores, that we do not give Amazon.com all of our business, that we support independent publishers.
Now that they've knocked out all the mom and pop stores, they have now established their first bookstore in Seattle.
It is truly dystopian that Amazon.com now has a bookstore in Seattle. And what part of what Amazon is trying to do right now is to displace publishing altogether. So they're entering into direct relationships with authors in order to eliminate the role of publishers like Vigo and Percival Press and other independent publishers, so they can directly mediate between the authors and consumers and cut out spaces like this. And they are very consciously trying to destroy independent publishing and independent bookstores. That is their agenda in order to make their bottom line. And it's truly an insidious agenda, and one that we all have to consciously try to counter. I want to just, before I read a few words from my foreword, which Vigo asked me to do, I just want to comment on two things from the headlines in recent weeks that just remind us of exactly, as Amy was saying, how pertinent and current this history is today. Just last week I was in London working on a project, and suddenly Tony Blair was in the headlines again. Of course, Tony Blair was in the headlines for a while now because he saw a remarkable rebellion take place against his legacy and the British Labour Party with the election of Jeremy Corbyn as the Labour leader of the opposition, which I think is a remarkable development and a sign of the desire and the hope for change that so many people feel in this moment, and really a remarkable achievement when you think about who Jeremy Corbyn is, and what he represents, and how rooted he is in social movements, and how many years he spent being part of, in particular, movements against war and empire. I first met Jeremy Corbyn when he brought me to speak in Parliament, remarkably, about my book, Iraq, The Logic of Withdrawal, something that never could possibly happen in this country. And he's a remarkably dedicated and humble and serious organizer of grassroots movements. And so for him to come to that position represents such a rejection of the legacy of Tony Blair and what he led, along with the U.S. In organizing and paving the way for the invasion and occupation of Iraq. But even around 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, Tony Blair had to admit publicly that the invasion and occupation of Iraq was partly responsible for the rise of Islamic State and the politics that are now being used to justify new wars throughout the region, and the instability and the destabilization of Western Asia and the Middle East. And then this week, of course, we hear this is from the front page of the New York Times. President Obama announced on Friday that he had ordered several dozen special operations troops into Syria for the first open-ended mission by the United States ground forces in that country, deepening American involvement in the war. And then, of course, it goes on to point out that the president's military move was the latest step into the expanding conflict in Syria and next-door Iraq, once intent on just using American air power, as Amy pointed out. These are the two poles of possibility to help local forces on the ground. Mr. Obama has now sent 3,500 American troops to Iraq. So once again, we are in Iraq. Once again, we are part of an ongoing and open-ended military engagement. And its roots really do begin not just with the invasion and occupation of Iraq 13 years ago, but before that, as this book points out, with a series of commitments that the United States made to dominating that region. So I'll just read really quickly from a little bit of my introduction, and then throw it back to you, Amy. The crimes against the people of Iraq documented in this important book continue to unfold. Iraq remains one of the most violent places on earth. Millions have been displaced. The cycle of sectarian violence encouraged and institutionalized by the United States is likely to play out for years to come. Women have seen hard-won social gains set back decades. All of this was predictable, and indeed was predicted, but ignored by an establishment press that paved the way for the invasion and occupation, and a political elite that spoke of democracy and freedom, but was in truth guided by the vision of Condoleezza Rice, George Bush's national security advisor and later Secretary of State. In the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks, which had nothing whatsoever to do with Iraq, Rice asked senior national security staff to think about how to, quote, capitalize on these opportunities, which were, quote, shifting the tectonic plates in international politics to the advantage of the United States. Quote, I really think this period is analogous to 1945 to 1947, she told Nicholas Lehman of The New Yorker. And it is important to try to seize on that and position American interests and institutions and all of that before they harden again. In reality, Washington has created greater instability throughout the region, seen its own influence diminished, enhanced the power of Iran, and spurred extremely reactionary religious and political currents, all at great cost to the people of Iraq and its neighbors. The devastation of Iraq started long before, when Washington actively backed and armed the brutal regime of Saddam Hussein as it carried out its worst abuses. It continued through years of sanctions that did not harm the regime, but stunted and killed the poor, elderly, and most vulnerable in Iraq, something that Democracy Now! Reported on. It was further exacerbated by years of aerial warfare against the country, foreshadowing the drone wars of today. Instead of acknowledging these crimes, let alone paying reparations for them, as a small but principled wing of the anti-war movement has rightly demanded, including Iraq Veterans Against War. I think there may be some people from IVAW here tonight. The U.S. government and establishment press have spun new fictions to justify its past actions in Iraq and paved the way for renewed intervention. In this mythology, we, in the common phrasing of the media that so uncritically embrace rather than challenge our government, may have lost our way at certain points in Iraq, but then the surge worked. A fiction that allowed the Bush administration to cover for its crimes in Iraq, and as Stephen Walt observed in Foreign Policy, let President Bush hand off the problem to his successor. Then, just as we were securing the peace in Iraq, we pulled out prematurely and abandoned the country. Our failure then, that is, was not the invasion and occupation of Iraq, was not the invasion and occupation, but the withdrawal of most U.S. forces. And that really sets the backdrop for what we now see happening in the so-called debates. There's really very little debate, and where, once again, we're on the verge of escalation and reintroduction of even more troops into Iraq. And so it's really a great service that you've done, Vigo, by making this resource available to us again and reminding us of the tasks we have ahead, unfortunately, that continue from 12 years ago.
Vigo, would you read your poem that you wrote in Twilight of Empire?
Immodestly, I'm going to read something I wrote in the original one. It's a poem I wrote for the first edition that I wrote it in early February 2003, not long before the invasion. And the reason I want to read it is because there's some other really nice poems in here, including by someone from Iraq. Sometimes, as I'm sure you know, other than just facts or really well-written essays, great forwards like there, sometimes you can make a point in a different way. There are some audiences that are less likely to maybe listen to facts, information sometimes, or they just can handle only so much. Sometimes you can capture something in a different way, you know. And I wrote this poem, a sort of free-form feeling about the history of that region and what was going on, and you know, thinking back to George W. Bush's father's 91, you know, jaunt over there and so forth. Anyway, the setting is obviously Iraq or Babylon, and there's a reference to the Tigris and the Euphrates. The poem's called Back to Babylon. Accept and forget difference or desire that separates, leaves us longing or repelled. Why briefly return to play in broken places? That's the only thing about the poem that's not exactly right, the briefly part. Why briefly return to play in broken places, to mock the ground, to collect infant shards, coins, fossils, or the familiar empty canisters and casings that glint from poisoned roots in the blackened dust? We make bad ghosts, and are last to know or believe we too will fade, just as our acrid smoke and those strange flakes of skin and strands of hair will, into largely undocumented extinction. Lie down, lie down. Sleep is the best thing for being awake. Do as we've always been told and done. No backward glances or second thoughts, leaving sad markers buried in the sand. Sleep now, dream of children with their heads still on, of grandmothers unburdening clotheslines at twilight, of full kettles slow ticking over twig embers. Ignore boneless, nameless victims that venture out on bitter gravel to claim remains while we rest. Pay at the window for reheated, prejudiced incantations. Take them home and enjoy with widescreen, half-digested, replayed previews of solemn national celebration. Then sleep, by all means. We'll need all the energy we can muster for compiling this generation's abridged anthology of official war stories, highlights of heedless slaughter to burnish our long and proud imperial tradition. At some point, by virtue of accidentally seeing and listening, we may find ourselves participating in our own rendering. Few of our prey will be left alive enough to water the sun with their modest, time-rubbed repetitions to rephrase their particular unifying laws. Our version of events has already made its money back in foreign distribution and pre-sales. All victory deadlines must be met. It can get so quiet, with or without the dead watching our constant deployments. From our tilted promontory, we may see one last woman scuffle away across cracked parchment of dry wash beneath us, muttering to herself, or is she singing at us, as she rounds the sheared granite face and disappears into a grove of spindly, trembling tamarisk shadows lining the main road. We'll soon hear little other than our own breathing, as shale cools and bats rise to feed, taking over from startled swallows. Night anywhere is home, darkness a cue for turning inward, quiet an invitation to review our expensive successes before mourning extraction from the twin rivers of our common cradle. February 2003. Amy has dealt with millions and millions, literally, of audiences, and is expert at, she can stir things up for us, hopefully.
So maybe I can handle you guys. But, you know, yesterday on Democracy Now!, when Vigo was on, we were also talking about a controversy that's somewhat raging locally and even nationally. And it's about Quentin Tarantino criticizing police killings of unarmed civilians. And, you know, there are interesting connections between Iraq, Afghanistan, and the war at home. For example, I mean, think about Ferguson and those images of the Pentagon being somewhat conservationist, and so taking equipment from Iraq and Afghanistan and giving it to police departments around the country. And what happens then when local police departments have tanks, have drones, have automatic weapons, etc. Now, Quentin came to a protest. Was anyone at that protest?
Mike.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, October 24th at Washington Square, and then folks march up to Bryant Square. Check this out. My colleague Juan Carlos, who's filming right now, and I were there, and there was Quentin on the stage, unabashed, condemning the killings. In fact, he hardly spoke because he said he wanted that time to be used by there were like 40 families who had come from around the country because they had lost loved ones or loved ones had been shot by police. He's being criticized by police unions for speaking out and taking this position. And I wanted to ask Vigo about what it means to speak out. I mean, that's what you're doing right now. You're a mega star. So you have a lot to lose, and yet here you are, taking on the powers that be on a global scale.
Well, the good thing is that it's too late now. I mean, if I suddenly go, well, maybe I'll keep my mouth shut and I won't affect my chances of employment with certain people. I have no regrets. I've also been lucky. I've kept working, doing my thing, and I have got, you know, probably not nearly as much as you have, but over the years, and certainly at that time, 2002, 2003, by virtue of the fact that, along with everybody else that was in Lord of the Rings, I was, you know, a known, as Rumsfeld would say. Although he didn't seem to pay much attention to that. The known thing. Anyway, that's another. We can talk about that too. And so I got hundreds and hundreds of emails and letters and all kinds of things every day. I would say 99% of which were, you know, go to France and from there, worse. And, you know, some very threatening things and stuff on the street. And I also got, you know, some communications from people in the movie business. You know, we'll not hire you, so forth. So, yeah. It doesn't really make any difference because there are certain things that are more important than anything else. You know, the issue, the reason that Quentin Tarantino went and spoke, and I thought that, I mean, he didn't say that much, but what he said was to the point. And in his defense, if any of you saw him on Chris Hayes' Night Before Last, I think it was, he was very eloquent, he was very calm, he was prepared, he was thoughtful. He was, I mean, you have to be willingly deaf and blind to not hear him. You have to be willingly deaf and blind not to see what's on certain videos that fortunately were made with telephones, you know, of things that have happened the last couple of years in the country. And so those things are more important than the fact that Quentin Tarantino has a movie coming out soon. Actually, I think that, everybody in this room who wasn't going to see that movie is probably going to, so I think it'll probably backfire on the cops. But the thing that I found the most, that I find as disturbing as the actual violence and the abuses of power by the cops is, and in long term it's much more disturbing, is the fact that these heads of police unions and heads of police departments are essentially condoning what happened. They're certainly not saying, yeah, we'll look into it, maybe we'll change something, and then whether they do or not. They're not even doing that. They're attacking the messenger rather than saying we have a problem. But as far as, what you're saying, basically, yeah, you can get shit for it, and, there's been periods of history in this country. There's a movie that came out, I think, today also, about Dalton Trumbo, that's the blacklist period. I mean, during, I think a lot of journalists, a lot of people felt the sting during, the first part of this, the first decade of this new millennium, felt the sting in ways not unlike that blacklist period, and certainly foreigners or people that looked a certain way in this country or trying to get into this country felt that, and that's still going on here and in Canada, two countries that pride themselves on being open-minded and liberal and free-thinking. So, I think in Canada, we know that things are looking like they're going to change because of what happened in the recent election there. We'll see. And certain things have already changed. Trudeau has said, I'm not participating in what you guys are doing in Syria, for example. Let's see what happens here. I don't know. The ongoing, just like we have a permanent state of war, we have a permanent state of electioneering, of campaigning. It's become sort of a reality show, so it's hard to say what's going to happen. I do think it's pretty certain that the things we're talking about here are not really going to be discussed much by anybody. Certainly not by Hillary Clinton. She has good reason not to talk about it. As does Bernie Sanders, for all the good things he's doing, pushing her to talk about economic inequality and economic justice and climate and other things. He's not going to really be talking about this, I don't think.
Anthony, what about making those connections between militarization at home and what's going on abroad, and which really, at this point, is unprecedented? How many wars the U.S. is involved with and bringing other countries into those countries?
Yeah, I think you put it exactly right, Amy, that there's a war at home that's corresponded with war abroad, and that's always been the case in U.S. history. There's always been an economic cost in terms of the millions and billions that go into war that are taken away from programs of social uplift, from education, from healthcare, from jobs, from community building, from infrastructure. But it also has always gone hand in hand with repression. Police repression, governance repression, surveillance, infiltration. And in the case of Iraq, we've seen a particularly vicious cycle where the people who are being asked to make the ultimate sacrifice, people who are risking their lives, who were sent to Iraq, and the people who ended up forming groups like Iraq Veterans Against War, saw so clearly how that war came home in the psychological consequences, and the consequences for families, for communities, the domestic abuse that grew out of all the ways that the violence came home and affected communities, the families that were torn apart by the violence, and you have a whole new generation of people who have been involved in basically what is a poverty draft. We got rid of conscription in this country, formally, but if you look at the demographics of which communities are supplying the people who are fighting these wars, who are dying in these wars, it is a poverty draft. It's people from the poorest rural communities of this country who have no economic opportunities, who have no educational opportunities, and the only possibility that they see for themselves is taking part in military training, and then in some cases finding very quickly the reality of what that means and the contradictions between what they're told they're being sent to fight for and what they are fighting for. And what's been really inspiring about this last period are the people like Camilo Mejia, like the people in Iraq Veterans Against War, people like Chelsea Manning, who have gone and seen what is being done in our names, and who said, I'm not going to take part in this, and I'm going to resist it, and I'm going to speak out against it, and I'm going to do whatever I can to let people know what the reality of these occupations is. So I think what's really fascinating to me about this last period is, if you put it in a broader historical context, is I think there's been more of those voices of the soldiers themselves, of the military families themselves, of the communities affected by their loved ones being sent off to fight and die in this war than has ever happened in U.S. history. And so to me, that is one of the most inspiring elements of the opposition that has happened. There hasn't been nearly enough opposition, but that has been a very remarkable and important part of what has taken place. And we owe enormous gratitude to Chelsea and to all those people who've taken those risks. And of course, we have to put Ed Snowden into that picture as well. Because, coupled with the military-industrial complex, is now a national surveillance industrial complex and a domestic surveillance complex. And so to have people from within that complex, like Ed, speak out and expose what that's really about has been really remarkable and has given us a much clearer picture about the real machinations of empire.
To the point of what you're saying about, kind of relates that what you asked me about, when you see what happens to whistleblowers in this country, and more importantly, when you see what happens to soldiers who fight the wars, that they shouldn't have to be fighting. If there's a war to be fought, it should be a different war than these, certainly. When you see the cost to them, you can hardly complain that a few less people will go to your movie, or that you might not get that role. I mean, that's very, it would be really selfish to complain about that. So that's the short answer to your question. I don't really have anything to complain about. I have my legs, I have my arms, I have my voice. I'm in good company. I'm well fed, and I'm, relatively happy. So very well.
We're going to open up the floor to you guys if you have a question or a comment. I just wanted to add, as you talk about whistleblowers, I was heading into the Ecuadorian embassy in London to interview Julian Assange a few months ago when the interview with Hillary Clinton came out in The Guardian, and she was talking about Ed Snowden. And she said, as a number of the politicians are saying at the time, he should man up and come home. And Hillary Clinton particularly said, he could launch a vigorous public and legal defense. Why doesn't he come home? And you think about what happened to Chelsea Manning. You never heard her voice again once she was arrested. It was her voice that was so threatening to the U.S. government. Even though they captured her body, tortured her, she was in solitary confinement for I don't know how long. But it was forbidden to record her voice in court. If you're a regular listener or viewer of Democracy Now!, we broadcast her voice in court because audio was smuggled out. It was very muffled, but we felt it was so critical. If they felt it was critical, you not hear it. We felt it was critical, you do hear it. And so for these politicians to say, what is the problem? You can come home and defend yourself. And certainly, look at what's happened to Julian Assange, who's been in the embassy year after year when we know there's a major case being brought around treason and espionage against Julian Assange here in the United States. And what he fears is not going to Sweden, because he would do that and answer whatever questions are being raised about another case. But what he's concerned about is that he would then be taken and extradited to the United States, where he could not defend himself in the way that he feels would be just. These are critical questions that all of us have to ask, whether we're talking about war or surveillance, the information we have access to. But let's open the floor.
And there are microphones. So let's get people on microphone.
I've got a microphone here, so I think that means I get to ask a question. My name is Jake Bridge, and a year and a half ago I was an officer in the Marines, and I had an awakening. So I filed for conscientious objector status, and I was discharged. I was discharged this past May as a conscientious objector, so I understand what it is to stand up for what you believe in, as inconvenient as it is, and suffer the scorn of possibly your family, friends, and coworkers. So I would like to thank you all for doing what you do. My question is, you mentioned the draft. I think maybe the fact that we don't have a draft is one of the reasons why there is no robust and universal, at least in America, fight against these wars, because we don't all have skin in the game anymore. And another thing is that it allows us to have the military everywhere in our culture. They run around during the football games, they run around during baseball, it's on billboards everywhere, and when you complain about it, they say, well, we have to recruit somewhere, there's no draft, right? In my opinion, I think if we were to reinstate the draft, I think we'd have a much better chance to fight wars, because I think everybody would have to care or risk getting sent. And I wondered if anybody had an opinion on that.
I think you might be right. And also, I think that a lot of people who were drafted would resist the draft. And there would be, I think what happened during the last years of the Vietnam War would happen again, because it's with the ability to communicate that we have today compared to then. Although, I think most people, and I count myself, I have to make an effort not to do this, they tend to go to what they already know and think. They just amplify their own ideological point of view, generally, using media. But I think with the ability to communicate, I think, it's not talked about enough how many people commit suicide when they come back. But I think that, combined with people saying, I'm going to wherever I have to go, or I'm just not going. Make me go, I won't fight. That, you can't hide that for too long. If it starts adding up, there's lots and lots of people. So I think for that reason as well.
Can I ask you a quick question? How hard was it to get conscientious objector status?
The hardest part was writing the application. The application is a huge document that requires a bunch of psychologists and doctors, and you have to get analyzed by many different officers, and they all have to weigh in, get sent up the chain of command all the way to the top of the Marine Corps. If they say yes, you're done. If they say no, it goes even higher to the Secretary of the Navy. If you have done enough reading and you know your opinions on things, it's not that difficult, but it is a long process, and it took me about 11 months from start to finish to get out of there. So the waiting is certainly brutal, and there were a couple times where I considered maybe just going to jail instead of going to work.
Is that what you would have done if they'd said no? Or what would you have?
I would have tried to reapply, and if that wasn't an option, I absolutely would have gone to jail for that.
Yeah. Thank you.
I really admire your stance, and I'm really glad to see you wearing an IVAW t-shirt.
Thank you very much.
Assume you're working with IVAW, which is
I
great.
am.
I just want to present the contrary position, and I realize I'm in a minority perhaps, because I understand the appeal, and certainly heard and thought about the arguments about what a draft would potentially bring about in terms of greater sacrifice and possibly greater opposition. But I think if you look at the history of the draft in this country and the ability of people with privilege to escape the draft, it was actually progressive that we eliminated a draft in this country. And it came about as a result of very important struggles. And rather than go back to the draft, I would like to take on the challenge that you said about confronting military recruitment. And there is really interesting and important work to be done on that. And there is really interesting work to be done about challenging the role of the military in our culture. If people don't know the work, for example, of the sports writer Dave Zirin, he's been excellent at exposing that and talking about that, and particularly around the case of Pat Tillman. And we're not going to have time to go into that whole story, but I think it's a very interesting story. So for me, actually, it would be regressive in many ways to bring back the draft, and we should be looking for ways to address all the injustice of the current economic draft. and the poverty draft and the role of the military without looking for shortcuts to building the kind of social movement that it would take in this country to really bring that kind of change about.
I'm also asking about the draft because I came up in the 70s, and yes, someone named Bush could go to the National Guard, but an awful lot of people in college who came from middle-class families didn't have that privilege or the means or the support or the access to lawyers or all the rest that it entails. Because as this gentleman just pointed out, it took him 11 months. See, my issue here is you're all great, the book is great, the show is great, we're all great, we all agree. We have to reach the people who don't agree with us. So my feeling is if we attached an amendment to the appropriations bill that stated that any time a service member was deployed overseas, it would automatically trigger a draft, they'd have to stop and think before they voted. Because then their districts are going to be up in arms because the kids are going to have to go. So I think we have to think along the lines not of addressing us, we all agree, we're the choir, right? We have to somehow reach out to the people who do not agree with us. And I know how hard it is. Look what just happened in Kentucky. 400,000 people are losing their health insurance because they didn't go out and vote. I mean, this was, something they needed and wanted. What's the problem with Kansas? So I'm not minimizing the problem, but I just think if somehow we put their children at risk, and God knows I don't want them to be at risk, but if that's what a vote or for a president to send troops, if that's what it meant, then maybe we would be able to reach a larger audience.
By the way, I think the choir may be national and really spread across the political spectrum. If you look at the crowds that have come out to Bernie Sanders, whether or not you support him, it has been astounding. He didn't have the megaphone that Donald Trump has. Every time Donald Trump opens his mouth, all of the media is there, from Fox to MSNBC to CNN. Yesterday, the day before, he launched a new book, Crippled America, I think. All of the networks broke away from their regular programming for him to launch the book in a joint broadcast. Everything he does, he gets free media airtime. Now, Bernie Sanders has had unprecedented numbers of people, tens of thousands packing sports arenas. He had nothing like that kind of publicity, and yet still they came. And they represented every political viewpoint. Because what we're seeing in this country, the inequality, unprecedented in the United States, that sucking sound from the bottom to the top, everybody feels the top and the bottom. And they're deeply concerned about it. So I don't think that you should think it's a small group of people that need to spread the word. I think, I always say it's, when you talk about issues of war and peace, if you talk about climate change, the fate of the planet, or the growing inequality that threatens us all, it's not a fringe minority that cares about this. It's not even a silent majority. It's the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why it's so important we take the media back. We publish our own books. We support bookstores like these. We build our own media and support it. And challenge the corporate media, because, they are not just private corporations that you have to tune into. They are using a national treasure. They're using the public airwaves, and they have a responsibility to cover the full spectrum of opinion or have their licenses revoked. But yes, let's get another person.
Hi, my name is Miguel Silveira. I'm a filmmaker, just graduated from Columbia University, and have a lot of interest in making film work that relates to everything we're talking about here. And then, to me, following your question, I think that the biggest issue, of course, I agree with that, I understand that, but even though we are a gigantic number of people, it's still super complicated to actualize perhaps because the system's completely, as we all know, rigged, etc., etc., etc. The question to me, for the last 5 years of been going to school with amazing filmmakers, in 5 years I remember 2 films that were critical to come out of school. Great films that were critical against the war or whatever it is. And I'm very happy to say maybe one, it's okay, so, but.
What was your film?
It's about depleted uranium, I learned a lot about it of course, in your show, and then I made a film about that, and it played really well, but nobody would ask me questions, right? No, this is amazing, that's so shocking, I didn't know what done, right? So, in an environment as Columbia University's film program, I really would like to see you guys there, to communicate to NYU, etc., to communicate to filmmakers who perhaps have the knowledge and the intention, but even though our teachers are incredible, they don't have the encouragement from somebody from the industry or from the media to come and work with us. The military is there, right? But sometimes.
What do you mean the military?
Well, they recruit them.
ROTC.
Precisely. So, I just experienced in these 5 years, there's a where is the sounding board? And even though when we manifest ourselves, even though we know most of the things we're talking about right now, still within our small little group, right, there was no resonance. And to me, that's one of the reasons why it doesn't become law. It doesn't become, public. So what do you think? Would you come? Would you come?
Of course, all 3 of us. I'm going to speak for Vigo. We'll come to Columbia anytime. And in fact, there's a wonderful.
People's History. Have you ever done one there? A reading?
We haven't done a Voices of People's History at Columbia. We would love to do one.
Do you want to explain what that is?
It's just conveniently placed right here this time. Thank you, Al. It's this project, Voices of People's History of the United States, that I had the great privilege of working with Howard Zinn on. We actually have some people. Amy's been part of this project. Vigo's been part of this project.
Who did you play last night?
And Allison Moore are here.
Bartolomé Las Casas, Joe Hill, and Howard Zinn.
Yeah, and Allison sang Sam Cooke and Yip Harvard
And Bob Dylan.
and Bob Dylan, and Hayes Carl sang Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan. We had a lot of Bob Dylan last night. It's this project where we bring together the documents of people's history, of protest, of dissent, of popular organizing that have taken place in this country from its inception through to today. In fact, this is the 10th anniversary edition, and this new edition has Chelsea Manning's statement as she was being prosecuted for 35 years. And last night that was read by a terrific actor named Kathleen Chalfant. It's a project that we've brought to campuses and schools and communities around the country as a way of reminding people of this important and rich history of protest and dissent, and how vital it is and inspiring it is for our struggles today. So it's absolutely the kind of thing we could do at Columbia University. And I would also just say at Columbia University you have a great resource, which is in the film program is Jane Seamus, who's a remarkable filmmaker and activist and organizer, and whose partner Nancy Krikorian is one of the founders of Code Pink. So we have allies, but it's really about knitting together all of these struggles and communities. And as Amy says, I really think, I'm often reminded of a line from Percy Shelley, who wrote a brilliant poem that we actually featured when we did the British version of this project a few years ago, called The Mask of Anarchy. And that poem ends with Shelley saying, very eloquently, much more eloquently than I could ever put it, "Ye are many, they are few." And I think this has always been a problem for us, that we do have these numbers, we do have the sentiment, but it's about how you organize it and channel it into effective protest. But in terms of your very specific question, absolutely we will come to Columbia University and we'll do what we can to help there.
There's another thing about this, the frustrating thing of, millions marched. I was in London with 1 million people before the war, and all over the country, people were protesting. It's like, that many people, well, this isn't going to happen, because it's not like with Vietnam, where it was towards the end, and then that stopped it. It's like, this is before it's happening, so it can't happen. Well, it did. And then some people do tune out. do check out or they feel defeated and they just don't continue. That's part of the problem as well, I think. And it made me think that you're talking about this about Albert Camus talked about for his generation about Spain, which had 40 years of dictatorship after the legitimate democratic government was taken out and by Franco. And he said, for my generation, and he's someone who's of Spanish descent through his mother, and he had said during, he was spoke a lot about the Republic, about the ousted Republic, for the rest of his life after the Civil War, and he dreamed of going to Spain, the land of his ancestors. And he spoke Spanish, he spoke some Catalan, and he was someone who was passionate about Spain and its history and its literature and so forth. And said, I really am dying to go there, but I will never go there until Franco is gone. And, unfortunately, Camus left us before Franco. But he said something that is worth bearing in mind. He said, what my generation learned from what happened in Spain was that justice is not always rewarded, and that the courage of those who are in the right is not always compensated. That's not to say it never is, but it's not. If it was easy, then everybody would be doing it. Everybody would take part and so forth. It's not. And the main thing is to stick around and to keep at it, like these guys do. Through their writings, their appearances, what they say, what they do. They put their money where their mouth is. And there are hundreds of more setbacks than there are victories in this overall struggle that has to do with all kinds of things that have been mentioned today, not just the situation in Iraq or what this book talks about, but the problems of society. And that's why, as I said to Amy when I was on her show the day before yesterday, I said, I love the name of your show, Democracy Now! ! Because that's what it is. It's a process. It's not a thing, a static thing, any more than independence or freedom from want, freedom from suffering. It's not, we're all going to die, we're all going to have bad days, and the world is going to continue to have more bad days than good days. And so it's just an individual choice. You either quit or you keep going. And the most important thing is that there's a certain number of people that always keep going. And the more people keep going, the more chances, obviously, it's simple, that things are going to change. So, I don't know.
Yes, thank you. I don't want to be the voice of doom, only saying two things.
Go ahead, it's good practice for us. It's good practice for us, go for it.
Because, I have a daughter, I have a 4-year-old granddaughter. I'm much older than I look. I'm probably the oldest person in this room that thinks so or not. And I see a deterioration in not you, but your business. You talk about the media and getting them on the straight and narrow.
By the way, I don't see it as a business, I see it as a mission.
Yes, thank you for correcting me. I agree with you. But it is becoming a business. Take Walmart. I have a shoe today. It is known that, for those who know, they have spent about 2 generations now accumulating enough money for their progeny to exist happily and wealthily for a long time to come. They did it on the backs of American human beings. The low wages, the lack of benefits. I've never been in the Walmart, and I will never go into a Walmart, and there are people who don't understand. They need the good prices, but on whose backs? We're used to having it off the backs of foreign workers, but now it's American workers. Okay, speaking of media, I was repelled to Walmart now is a sponsor on public broadcasting. Walmart now is a sponsor on American broadcasting. And maybe for those of you who are familiar with other channels, maybe you've seen it elsewhere. But this is not a good sign. And then I read in...
Well, let me just interrupt. That's a very good reason to support your community radio, independent radio station in New York, WBAI, which is not brought to you by corporations, but brought to you by listeners like you, and they always need your support. We're going to have to wrap up, so if you could make your question just, if you could wrap up your question.
Well,
But I actually think you've raised a really important point. You're saying that you feel a great deal of doom because you look at the powers of a corporation like Walmart and all
what's
they...
happening in the so-called helping Iraq recover from Naomi's article in here.
Naomi Klein has written one of the pieces in this book.
I thought I knew a lot, but oh my goodness. So critical.
So let's get response. It's a good way to wrap up the whole discussion. But on the issue of everything from the increasing inequality in the U.S. to what's happening in Iraq, and
Well, on the question of everything.
you have a theory about that.
Yeah, I have a theory of everything. Yeah, there was a great article about Noam Chomsky in the New Yorker about 10 years ago. It was called The Everything Explainer. I am not the Everything Explainer. But no, I'm extremely optimistic about this political moment right now because I see so many people looking for an alternative. I see so many people not satisfied with the neoliberal status quo. I see a sea change on the campuses. When I was in college, you could not talk about Palestine. It was impossible. Your meetings would be shut down. Now you go on campus. I'm sorry. I mean, it's just a sea change in terms of the possibility of talking about the realities of the injustice that is now being conducted against the Palestinian people. And you can have Jewish and Palestinian and Arab and Muslim students organizing together in a way that was never possible even years ago. You have the growth of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. You have an environmental consciousness which was not even on the horizon a few years ago, which is now burgeoning into serious protest and has led to the shutdown of the Keystone XL pipeline. There is a consciousness about class, there is a consciousness about the need for making those connections that I think so many people who are making today about the war abroad with the war at home. And there's a growth of independent media like Democracy Now! Democracy Now!, when I first heard Amy on the program, was on, one kind of pirate station that was under siege. And it is now on, how many stations are you on?
Close to 1,400.
I mean, that is a remarkable people demanding that it be brought onto their community radio stations. So, I don't know. I think once you are actually engaged, you have so many more reasons for hope than if you're standing on the sidelines. So I think ultimately what Vigo said really summed it up perfectly. You have to be engaged, and you have to understand that there's many setbacks, and that we're in it for the very long haul.
So as we wrap up right now, we're not quite done here because Vigo and Anthony, and I'll hold the books for them to sign, are going to be signing books. So I'll end with the last paragraph of, my input into this wonderful collection. Read this book, share this book, the holidays are coming up, it is a fantastic gift to give, and engage in informed and frequent discussion on the topics within. Empire, occupation, war, peace, regardless of your position on the issues, make debate and dissent commonplace. For debate and dissent are at the core of any strong, healthy democracy. Only together can we break the sound barrier. Thanks so much.
Just very quickly, sorry to have you That was such a good end note. But they will be signing up here, and those of you who do want to book signing, we're going to form a line that will go up the stairs as a way of exiting. So that's a good thing. Thank you all. You stay here. Yeah. Yeah.
Be fine whenever. You want one, Ellen? Yes. Thank you for letting us sit. I just tried to be very still.
We're good.
Even my clapping was so still.
Yeah, you were
It's
good.
like I'm not.
You can sign and then you buy the stairs. Maybe
It's $14.95. Yeah, pay for the signing. I'm out here. You can. I could. I do a bottle of it, and then I take photographs and then I just upload it on. I mean, I would actually. I'd like Sorry about it. They're signing here and there. Yeah, I mentioned it. Right, I know. Hey, Alex. Thank you. Me
What's that?
Do you want what? Yeah, okay. So, do you want to go first or do I? It's up to you. I guess I would.
Well, I don't think they